Today for consideration of H.R. 3286, the Securing Open Source Software Act of 2023, H.R. 1501, the Unmanned Aerial Security Act, H.R. 3224, the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Extension Act of 2023, H.R. 3208, the DHS Cybersecurity On-the-Job Training Program Act, and H.R. 3254, the First Responders Access to Innovative Technologies Act. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, any requests for recorded votes may be postponed. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. First, I want to thank the ranking member for his cooperation and coordination in preparing for this bipartisan markup. I know we'll continue to have differing positions on policy approaches during this Congress, especially when it comes to the border, but protecting the homeland, improving DHS is our charge, and I believe all the bills being considered today make strides in achieving that goal, and I deeply appreciate his help and partnership. I'd also like to speak for just a moment on the bills offered by my colleagues. The Unmanned Aerial Security Act and the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Extension Act are timely and important pieces of legislation that I believe all members of the committee should readily support. H.R. 1501 is an important measure that would prohibit DHS from acquiring or contracting for drones manufactured by China or our other adversarial nations. The bill passed the committee and the House with broad support last Congress, and I commend Vice Chair Guest for his consistent leadership in standing up to CCP attempts to exploit our homeland. Additionally, H.R. 3224 extends the sunset of DHS's Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction, or CWMD, office past its current expiration at the end of this year. I thank Rep. D'Esposito for his attention to this important office, and particularly appreciate the provisions requiring transparency and a plan to improve morale from the Assistant Secretary of CWMD. I also support the measure offered by Rep. Jackson Lee and Rep. Payne and appreciate their bipartisan approach in incorporating feedback from our side. Lastly, I'm proud to lead another bipartisan measure today, H.R. 3286, focusing on improving our cybersecurity. In late 2021, a Chinese researcher discovered a new vulnerability in a widely used piece of open source software called Log4j. The vulnerability allowed hackers to access and control devices remotely, creating cyber risk in millions of devices worldwide. Cyber professionals called this vulnerability the most significant they had seen in their careers. We're still responding to that hack today. This vulnerability showcased the risks that open source software can introduce to our networks and digital assets. We were fortunate that the researcher who discovered the vulnerability reported it to the foundation that maintains Log4j rather than to the Chinese regime, as is required under China's so-called national security law. Without that researcher's brave action, the CCP could have exploited the vulnerability for their gain without us even knowing. Open source software is the bedrock of our digital ecosystem. Virtually every computer relies on it, and it is an inextricable and valuable part of our digital infrastructure. Open source software is free, distributed widely, and is maintained and refined by a trusted community of individuals and organizations. The collaborative nature of open source software offers tremendous opportunity for innovation and economic growth, but it comes with a unique set of security challenges as highlighted by the Log4j vulnerability response I mentioned. H.R. 3286, the Securing Open Source Software Act of 2023, which is the House companion to a bill sponsored by Senator Peters and Senator Hawley, is a direct response to the challenges we experienced in the Log4j vulnerability and aims to address security risks posed by other open source software components. The bill authorizes a number of activities at CISA and requires the agency to evaluate and better position federal agencies to securely use open source software. Specifically, it requires CISA to develop a framework to help the federal government manage its own risk. It's important to note, too, that this bill preserves CISA's position as a voluntary partner to critical infrastructure and does not authorize any additional regulatory authority to CISA or any other agency. Open source software is a vital part of our economy. As one of the largest consumers of open source software, the federal government must lead by example by improving how it manages its risk stemming from the use of open source software. I'm offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute to the bill that will make minor technical and other changes. I thank Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection Chairman Garbarino and Ranking Member Swalwell for joining me as co-sponsors on this important piece of legislation. This bill enables CISA to lead by example, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I now recognize the Ranking Member to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, over the past 20 years, the Committee on Homeland Security has forged a reputation as a serious, thoughtful panel that comes together to tackle challenging Homeland Security issues in a bipartisan manner. The hyperpartisan way the committee has been operating this Congress runs counter to that reputation, with last month's nearly 17-hour markup in which all 43 Democratic amendments were defeated, still fresh in our collective memory. I'm hopeful that we can find some areas of common ground. I heard your comments in your opening statement, Mr. Chair, and I look forward to working with you. For my part, I stand ready to support all 5 measures noticed today. I'm pleased that we are considering legislation authored by the gentlewoman from Houston, Representative Jackson Lee, to nurture talent within DHS to help address chronic cyber staffing shortages. According to CyberSeek, a national nonprofit that maintains a cybersecurity jobs heat map, there were over 750,000 cybersecurity job openings in 2022, including more than over 45,000 in the public sector. Over 30% of the federal cyber workforce is over the age of 55. Last year, the State of the Federal Cyber Workforce Report raised alarm bells about how expected retirements, the lack of entry-level and diverse talent, turnover, and the growing need for new skill sets pose a significant risk to the effectiveness of our cyber mission. With cybersecurity threats continuing to grow, the need for more trained cyber specialists will only increase. Enactment of Representative Jackson Lee's legislation will help enhance efforts to get current DHS personnel trained to fill cybersecurity vacancies. I'm also pleased that we are also considering the First Responder Access to Innovative Technologies Act as introduced by Representative Donald Payne Jr. H.R. 3254 directs the Federal Emergency Management Agency to maintain a uniform, predictable, and transparent process for DHS grantees to seek authorization to purchase innovative technology. As someone who served in my community for 27 years as a volunteer firefighter, I commend Mr. Payne for authorizing this legislation to help first responders access to tools to carry out their mission safely and effectively. I look forward to participating in debate on these 2 measures, along with the 3 measures sponsored by committee Republicans on the House floor in the coming days. More broadly, I stand ready to work with the chairman to ensure that a representative number of bills sponsored by Democrats get the consideration they deserve by the full House. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Thompson, and other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We'll get started. Pursuant to notice, I call up House H.R. 3286. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 3286.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with and it is considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3286 offered by Mr. Green.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with and the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered base text for purpose of further amendments. Does anyone wish to speak on the amendment?
Move to strike this last word. Thanks.
You're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and appreciate you writing this legislation, the Securing Open Source Software Act. I think it represents that we believe the federal government, as we face persistent threats from Russia, China, independent cyber actors, must lead by example in the way that we close any vulnerabilities. I also want to thank Subcommittee Chairman Garbarino, and of course our ranking member and our team for working to bring this to a markup. When the Log4j vulnerability was disclosed in December of 2021, as the chairman noted, CISA director described it as one of the most serious I've seen in my entire career, if not the most serious, due in large part to its ubiquitous use on both consumer and enterprise devices. Through the JCDC, CISA and its partners responded aggressively and deserve tremendous credit for the work and effort to promote remediation. But the fact remains that instances of the Log4j vulnerability continue to exist on far too many networks and will be exploited by malicious actors for years to come. More broadly, the Log4j vulnerability, coupled with other high-profile cybersecurity events, forced important conversations about secure software development. Open source software continues to play an important role in facilitating innovation and efficiency, but we rely on nonprofits and volunteers to identify and fix vulnerabilities, and security is not always the principal priority during development. To date, we have not yet developed a formalized framework for evaluating the security of open source software components. This bill does just that. The Securing Open Source Software Act, together with other actions taken by the administration to promote secure software development, will dramatically reduce the number of vulnerabilities in the system we rely on, and as a result, reduce the number of successful cyber attacks. So I look forward to working with the chairman, and the subcommittee chairman, and our team through our ranking member to see this passed, brought to the floor, and signed into law. Thank you, Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you. Would anyone else care to make comments on the amendment? Hearing none, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of the substitute? Hearing none, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by myself. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting the bill. H.R. 3286 is amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1501. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 1501.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with and it's considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Guest of Mississippi, Vice Chair of the committee, for the purpose of explaining his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is imperative that the Department of Homeland Security be able to protect our nation against all threats. That threat includes ensuring that unmanned aerial air systems, UASs or drones, that DHS uses or buys are not made in foreign countries and do not align with the interests of those countries like China. DHS uses drones for everything from surveilling the border to Coast Guard national security cutter operation need for a persistent airborne surveillance capability. Utilizing drones is a cost-efficient way to cover large areas of the homeland. Unfortunately, many of the commercial drones used in the United States are manufactured in China, which dominates the United States market. A single Chinese drone manufacturer, DJI Technology Company, owns over 70% of the market share. The former Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency director wrote that any information collected by a drone from this particular manufacturer should be considered at risk and protected from inadvertent disclosures. DHS has also issued warnings in recent years about Chinese-made drones, specifically citing concerns that they may be sending sensitive data to their manufacturer in China, where it can then be accessed by the Chinese government. And our colleagues in the Senate share our concern. Last Congress, Senator Rick Scott introduced similar legislation to ban the purchase and use of these drones across the federal government, not just within DHS. Given the role that drones have in protecting our homeland, it is more important than ever to require DHS to assess its drone fleet. We need to assure DHS is using drone technology made by companies that are completely unaffiliated with the CCP. My bill does two things. First, it would require DHS to collect an assessment and report to Congress on current threats to the drone fleet we have now. Second, the bill would prohibit DHS from buying or using drone and drone technology made in a covered foreign country going forward. I would like to thank other members of this committee who have co-sponsored this legislation, particularly Chairman Green, who is a co-sponsor, and I urge my colleagues to support this common sense piece of legislation. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Guest. Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill?
Mr. Chairman, I have a question.
You're recognized, Mr. Agnew.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to vote to support this, but I was curious as to whether there are drone manufacturers available to the United States at this time, or is that something that we're going to have to address in a different way? And also, maybe as a follow-up, and maybe that's not for this committee, but maybe we should take steps to, if necessary, facilitate drone manufacturing in the United States, maybe with subsidies or tax breaks or whatever. But I just want to make sure that we have the ability to get what we need on that front.
So do you yield to Mr. Guest then?
I yield, yes.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Ivey, it is my understanding that we do have the capability to supply the needs of DHS. Again, China controls the majority of the majority of drones that are sold in the United States are manufactured overseas, specifically in China. And I do agree with you that that is a manufacturing sector that for national security reasons that we need to continue to grow and bolster. But based upon conversations that my office has had and that staff has had, we do believe that if this legislation were to pass, that DHS would be able to meet their needs. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his response, and I thank you for your work on this and your leadership in getting this done. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak on the bill?
Mr. Chairman,
You're
I have
recognized.
an amendment at the desk.
Okay, we need to wait on that
All right.
until everybody has talked on the bill
Understood.
first. Mr. Thompson, the ranking member is recognized.
Well, I just actually want to get to it. I want to reserve a point of order.
Okay. Anyone else interested in speaking on the bill? Are there any amendments to the measure that have been filed with the clerk?
Mr. Chairman,
You're recognized?
as indicated, I have an amendment at the desk.
And Mr. Chair, I reserve the point of order against the amendment.
Point of order reserved. The clerk shall report and distribute the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1501, offered by Mr. Bishop of North Carolina. Page 7, beginning line 3. Insert the following.
No,
For-
sorry, Mr. Chairman, that's not the correct one. The other one needs to be, I indicated was number 1. I've got 2, but that's not, she started to read from the other one.
If the clerk will read the other amendment and make sure we're distributing the correct one.
Nope.
So, Mr. Bishop, just so you know, the procedure is and the responsibility is yours to make sure that the clerk has the right amendment. It is not the clerk's responsibility, FYI.
Mr. Chairman, I just designated it to my staff. I don't know what the communications error was, but I specifically indicated which one should be marked.
Okay, let's get to the right one. In the future, for both sides of the aisle, let's make sure we get these sorted out. It's not on the clerk.
Hey, how you doing?
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I totally agree with the object of this bill. I think I voted for it before. And so I appreciate the sponsor bringing it forward. An astute staffer pointed out to me one drafting issue with the bill last night, which led in the course of discussion to recognize a second one. So that's why I have 2 amendments to propose. If you look at page 2 of the bill and you start at subsection A and condense the words, it says that the DHS is prohibited from buying, and then you go to subparagraph 1, an unmanned aircraft system or a drone, that A is manufactured in a covered foreign country. So far, so good. Or by a corporation domiciled in a covered foreign country, which first begs the question, if it's manufactured by a limited liability company or a limited partnership or a limited liability partnership or any of the perhaps hundreds of forms of business entities that are created by covered foreign countries but are not corporations, do we want to leave them out of this bill? And I think the answer is no. It's a basic drafting issue, and so I'm not sure that my fix for it in this amendment is a perfect fix, but it certainly will broaden it as appropriately as I can without the benefit of I'm sure there's out there somewhere somebody, an expert draftsman over in Legislative Council who could look at this and figure out what the language ought to be. But what I've suggested is to say, or by a corporation or any other type of business entity domiciled in a covered foreign country. That's my amendment, Mr. Chairman. I hope that explanation is sufficiently clear. I'd be glad to yield if anybody's got a question on it briefly. And not hearing any, I will yield back.
The gentleman yields. Would anyone want to make a further discussion about the amendment?
Mr. Chair,
Ranking member, you're recognized.
hearing Mr. Bishop's explanation and I will withdraw my reservation and defer to the maker of the bill to have any comments he might have on the amendment.
I recognize myself then to discuss about this. I have some concerns with the word business entity. Is there some place in code where that is defined? And I yield to Mr. Bishop.
I can't point to any, Mr. Chairman. And in fact, I think, as I said, I imagine there is a better fix for this that would be more inclusive. I think it should be totally independent of who the business is. I think you could probably say an unmanned aircraft system that is manufactured in a covered foreign country or by a person, and we're going to come to the word domiciled next, or by a person domiciled in a covered foreign country, and you would cover probably even unincorporated business associations, like a partnership, which is not arguably a general partnership, I don't think is a business entity. What I've tried to do is clean it up as best I can. I do think it ought not, there is an argument you can fix this later, but I've also confronted the argument once things have come through regular order that they're fixed and we shouldn't change things. So I think what I've tried to do is do as much as I can safely do within my own drafting ability without doing harm. But so business entity is not defined in my amendment or in the bill, neither is corporation for that matter. And I think perfect is not the enemy of the good, obviously. I think it is an obvious flaw that can be fixed substantially with this change, albeit not perfectly. Yield back.
Gentleman yields. My concern is with the definition business entity. And I understand the intent, and it's unfortunate that we're getting this just now, and this is actually my first time seeing this. I'm a little disappointed about that, but we'll have a conversation about that later. I am concerned about what business entity means. What would be great, what I encourage us to do, and I'd like to ask the gentleman offering the amendment, is if he would consider withdrawing the amendment and letting us work with him in the report language on the bill to make sure that corporation is well-defined.
Mr. Chairman, certainly want to accommodate the process well. If this has other references to other committees, I wouldn't object to doing this. If it's going directly to the floor from here, I don't think rules is the place to fix something that basic. Furthermore, I take the chairman's point about business entity being undefined, but since corporation is undefined as well and clearly under-inclusive, I don't think improving the bill is something we ought to defer. And the last point, I agree. I didn't hear about the issue until, it's not my bill, I haven't been involved in it, other than I voted for it before, I think. But it's come through before. This is frankly staff work. It ought to be done carefully. So as soon as we discovered it, we let committee staff know about it last night. We got these amendments prepared. We communicated them to other members. I think Mr. Guest didn't have a chance to see it until he sat down this morning. So I respect all those things, but don't shoot the messenger. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman? Thank you. I take the gentleman's point. I think it's a fair point to raise, but I recognize the chairman's concern as well. I would add one additional issue, which is there may be government types of entities that, depending on the country and how they structure their corporations or their business entities, that might also be involved. And China in particular might have government-sponsored or run entities that we'd want to capture. The only thing I could suggest on the fly would be to strike corporation and replace it with the word entity, an entity domiciled in a covered foreign country. That broadens it. It helps us avoid getting into trouble with definitions of corporations or business entities or the LLCs or all the other things that the gentleman mentioned, and might also give us the breadth to capture any other entities that we haven't thought of that might be of concern.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I would.
To that point, and I think that would be one way to go. It begs the question of course, something that's an unincorporated association, so would entity be the best word? But it also begs this question, which is coming next. But my subsequent amendment would be on the question of the word domicile. So the very next word is domiciled in a covered foreign country. And the problem with that is, as the gentleman knows, most litigators will think, well, a business corporation is under, for diversity jurisdiction purposes in federal courts, a citizen of the place where it's headquartered and of the law under location of the law under which it's incorporated. But the concept of domicile is actually broader than that. If a corporation has a presence by virtue of a predominance, albeit not the principal place of business in a particular location, for purposes of personal jurisdiction, the analysis is that domicile is yet another concept. It's undefined in the legislation. I was going to, if we got to the question of corporation or other business entity, domiciled, then in another place in the bill I was going to define domicile to mean principal place of business or headquarters, which I think gets the definitive concepts. Otherwise, I don't know if you know. Let's say that some business entity manufactures drones in one division, but has another division with substantial textile operations in China. Mm-hmm. Is it then domiciled in China or not? I think the last thing we should do is introduce some uncertainty that will prevent the drone market from developing because people will be worried about their operations in China. I mean, maybe not, but at least we should be clear about it. I yield back to the gentleman.
Gentleman yields to Mr. Ivey.
Just briefly reclaiming my time, I think the gentleman has a good point. And this is significant stuff, I think. So it might mean that we might need to find a way to give it additional time for us to clean up the language or make sure we're certain about the impact of what it would be. Yield back to the chair.
Gentleman yields. The ranking member is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kind of in concert with the conversation, we could, the maker could withdraw the amendment and work with the author of the bill, and before we go to floor consideration, do a manager's amendment or something like that for any technical corrections. So if there's no real disagreement with the bill, then I think that would be a way forward for us to work it out.
I agree. Does the gentleman yield? Or anybody else want to make a comment here? If I could, or Mr. Guest, you're recognized.
Very briefly, and I appreciate both the amendments brought forth by Mr. Bishop, but I would like to see us, if at all possible, continue to move this legislation to the floor. I think Ranking Member Thompson has a great potential solution, is that we continue working through these issues with committee staff, with Mr. Bishop, with our staff, to try to clean up these two areas where there might be some sort of ambiguity. But I think that we could do that between now and this legislation going to rules and ultimately to the floor. And so while in general I support the intent of these amendments, without having more time to kind of sit and look and digest the information, which just, and it wasn't Mr. Bishop's fault that we just all received here in the last few minutes, I would request that we continue to move forward with the bill without the amendments, but knowing that we're going to work to try to address these two issues that have been brought up. And with that, I yield back.
So if I could take just a second and say, corporation is defined in the code, right? Business entity is not, just for clarification points. So we don't know the definition of business entity. Entity itself, I understand, is a little bit more broad, and I think probably a bit catch-all. So I agree with Mr. Ivey and Mr. Bishop again on the intent. But I agree too with Mr. Guest's comment. We can easily fix this in the report language, and so again make the request that we withdraw the amendment and work it in the report language of the bill. And Mr. Jimenez is recognized.
I think I have a question, and I'll yield some time also to Mr. Bishop. The question is, take an example, say Apple Corporation. It's an American company, but it manufactures. It's domiciled. Is that domiciled in China? Would that if Apple manufactured drones in the United States, but it absolutely has a huge presence in China, would Apple drones be prohibited from being bought? And then I'll yield the rest of my time to
So I think on the issue of domicile, that amendment has not been brought forward. What we're talking about right now is just a striking corporation. When we get to, I think you have another amendment, if I understand. So when we get to that, we can have that conversation. And we'll let the person offering, Mr. Bishop, answer that question then. The question remains on this amendment, and Ms. Green, you are recognized.
I thought you yielded the rest of your time to me.
All right, well, that's right. You still have some time.
He yielded to me.
Okay,
I don't think it was
very well.
Thank you. And I thank Mr. Jimenez for yielding, and I think both the proponent of the bill and the chairman for the comments, couple of responses to that. If it were going to another committee where more committee work could be done in regular order to fix a problem like this, I think that's okay. That would be fine. I would support that. The bill going to the floor from here, in my judgment, where it can only be fixed in the Rules Committee or by an open rule on the floor, and in fact, I guess this will probably likely go as a suspension. I just don't think that's the appropriate course of action for something that is so fundamentally flawed in its draftsmanship. Not because of any member of this committee, on the minority or the majority, and we've had it come through here a couple times. It's just a flaw that needs to be fixed, and this is the right time to fix it. And I think we can take the time to do that. So I will not withdraw the amendment for that reason. On the other point made by the chairman, that corporation is defined in the code, but business entity is not, I would have to have some more specific information about that. Corporation probably appears in all of the titles of the United States Code thousands of times. I'd be surprised if entity doesn't appear. I certainly would be surprised if this hasn't been dealt with as a drafting matter some other place of the code that could be incorporated here to deal with. But in the absence of more information, that doesn't offer me any comfort. I'm skeptical that the word corporation is defined somewhere in the United States Code, and that then should solve the problem of interpretation that this obviously raises. I yield back.
Okay. Ms. Green, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think with the serious nature of this bill having to do with unmanned aircraft systems, it is extremely important to clean up the language here and to have it defined exactly the way we need it defined, not only for security reasons, but also for where our funds go, to who is manufacturing this, what country is manufacturing this. I completely agree with Mr. Ivy and Mr. Bishop that entity seems more of the correct language to use, and then defining what domiciled means. And I think it's worth taking the time to get this work done here on the committee before we send the bill to the
Gentlelady
floor.
yield?
Yes, I'll yield.
I appreciate the gentlelady yielding. I just, again, alert staff has just sent me this. Title 15 of the United States Code, Section 6764, defines the term business entity to be a corporation, association, partnership, limited liability company, limited liability partnership, or other legal entity, which is better than, that would be, you could refer to that if you wanted to be better than what we have. Even so, since we're dealing with the possibility of foreign entities, which may be of types not even recognized in that American list, I still don't think that, I think, frankly, Mr. Ivy comes closer to it, but again, I think that gets to the point that the information supplied to the chairman that corporations defined in the code, business entity is not, at least in that place, business entity is defined. So again, I think we're groping and we want to get to the right answer, but I submit that it ought to be done in this regular order process in this committee and not left hanging when we can all see that there's a problem. I yield back.
If I could just insert here on, for the sake of time, talked with the staff. I like Mr. Ivy's language personally. Mr. Ivy's language is to basically strike the word corporation and just put entity. I think that's what you said. And if that is acceptable to Mr. Bishop and to the remainder of the committee, what we can do is roll this bill to the last of the docket today. An amendment can be drafted, either yours or Mr. Ivy's, to change the word corporation to entity, which seems to me would solve the issue. Is that correct, Mr. Bishop?
I think it likely could, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. So without any further comment and on behalf of saving time, do you want to, if you want to be recognized? So,
I yield.
Okay. So what we're going to do is roll this bill to the last of the bills today and let Mr. Bishop work to, and maybe get Mr. Ivy's assistance and come up with the word that they like, and we'll call this bill up last and then see if that amendment can be added and everyone's content with it. While I have the floor, I do want to say the domicile issue, though, I am against the change of that, Mr. Bishop, and let me tell you why. As a member of Foreign Affairs, I am fully enlightened on the Chinese 2017 National Security bill they passed in their, I wouldn't necessarily call it a legislative body, but what it does is, even if something's headquartered in the United States, if they have a single office in China, the data has to be shared with China. So therefore, the language I saw on that, I just want to warn you, I am not going to support. So with that, we will, without an objection, the bill and the amendment are rolled to the end of the docket to today. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 3224. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 3224.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with and it is considered read and open to amendment at any time. I now recognize Mr. D'Esposito of New York for the purpose of explaining his bill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. Authorized in 2018, the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction CWMD office works with its operational partners at the federal, state, and local level to prevent the use of WMDs against the United States and to promote readiness for chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats. At the state and local level, the CWMD office helps promote readiness by providing funding, equipment, and expertise. In my home state of New York and in many other states across the country, the CWMD office operates the Securing the Cities program, which helps build regional capabilities to detect, analyze, and report nuclear and other radioactive materials. At the federal level, CWMD works with CBP to acquire radiation portal monitors that scan cargo at U.S. ports of entry and procures personal radiation detectors for the U.S. Coast Guard. With the authority of the CWMD office set to sunset at the end of this year, I am proud to introduce H.R. 3224, the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Extension Act. By extending the sunset clause on the CWMD office, the vital work of this DHS component made possible by this great committee will be able to continue. My legislation also takes meaningful steps to address some longstanding challenges that have faced the office. One such provision requires the Assistant Secretary for CWMD to submit a report to and brief Congress on a plan and strategy to improve morale within the office. In closing, I want to thank Chairman Green and Ranking Member Carter for being original co-sponsors to this legislation. I urge my colleagues to help ensure that CWMD is able to continue their vital work by supporting this bill. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill? Are there any amendments to the measure? Hearing none, the question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 3224 to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 3208. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 3208.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with and it is considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Thompson, the ranking member, to present this bill on behalf of Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Throughout my time on this committee, federal agencies have struggled to find cybersecurity talent necessary to fulfill their missions. With the private sector offering higher pay and more hiring flexibility, the federal government has been at a competitive disadvantage when it comes to attracting top cyber talent. As such, one important aspect of a broader federal cybersecurity workforce development strategy must be to utilize the talent we already have in the federal government, whether or not they have cybersecurity in their current job description. Many DHS components, not just CISA, have cybersecurity responsibilities as part of their mission, developing their employees. Cybersecurity skills will enhance cyber defense capabilities across the department by filling vacancies and strengthening the workforce. Representative Jackson Lee's legislation, the DHS Cybersecurity On-the-Job Training Program Act, would direct CISA to establish a training program for DHS employees not currently working in cybersecurity roles and authorize CISA to offer such training to other federal employees. Additionally, it directs the DHS Undersecretary for Management to help recruit and identify individuals for participation in the program, implement policies to encourage participation, and conduct outreach about DHS cybersecurity job opportunities for program participants. Finally, it requires CISA to submit an annual report to Congress on the program, including the matrix used to measure success of the program, an important aspect of ensuring accountability. I thank Chairman Green for working with Representative Jackson Lee and me on this legislation and for including it in this markup. I urge my colleagues to support the bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I recognize myself to talk about this bill. I think there are four critical areas in the cyber realm that this committee can work in a bipartisan fashion going forward to help protect what I consider is our fourth border, our cyber border. And probably number one is people. We are at a deficit for cybersecurity professionals in this country. There are ideas being floated, courses of action being floated to create a virtual academy, to do other things, but the shortage of cybersecurity experts is critical to our country. And this bill is a step forward in solving that problem. I will say the other three, reversing some of the economic models, synchronizing regulations throughout the government enterprise, and building a whole of government approach towards cyber are some of the other goals that I have and that we'll be talking with the ranking member over for the next several months that we will move forward. But in the meantime, this bill addresses the number one priority in our cyberspace, I think, and that is people. So I fully support the bill. I thank Ms. Jackson-Lee for allowing me to share my thoughts with her, and I thank the ranking member for presenting the bill. Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill? Are there any amendments to the measure?
Mr. Chairman, I have concerns about CISA in Section 2A, where it says to voluntarily train department employees who are not currently in a cybersecurity position for work in matters relating to cybersecurity at the department. CISA has proven to be a problem with spying on the American people. It has a history there, and I'm concerned about hiring people within CISA to be in charge of such an important issue, which is cybersecurity. So I don't know, I think that people should be hired from outside of the agency that are professionals in this field, not trained from within the agency. Cybersecurity is extremely important. It affects our government, it affects our military, it affects businesses. Businesses are hacked constantly, threatened, told that they have to pay large amounts of money in order to get their information back. I think if we're going to have a program that's taxpayer funded, it should be funded in such a way where we're hiring professionals. There's private companies that are professionals in cybersecurity. Even the Air Force has a training program for cybersecurity. So those are my concerns with this section of the bill.
Well, Lady Yield,
Yes.
Gentleman is recognized.
it's my observation that this would not present an expense. It would not require taxpayers' treasure. You're talking about people that are already employed and in place. So if you were interested in pursuing, advancing your career in this field, and you were working in that environment, and you could receive training from your coworkers. So the very nature of the bill does not encourage additional hiring from outside. You're talking about cross-training within. That's my understanding anyway. So I just wanted to clarify. I don't believe this bill burns America.
Gentlelady reclaims.
Yes, I reclaim. I think it would be costly just from business experience. In the bill, it says you have to develop a curriculum for the program, incorporating existing curricula appropriate, but developing a curriculum anytime you do something like that or create a program within an entity or a business, it does cost you money in order to do so. So we don't know that, but that's just my assumption based on experience. But those are my concerns with hiring within the agency. I think it'd be great to hire from outside of CISA. I yield.
So I think where we are is we're not on amendments yet. We're still talking about the bill. So does anyone else wish to speak on the bill?
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I would like to say, I agree with this bill. I think it's important. There are over 750,000 open cyber jobs in the country right now, 30,000 in the federal level. CISA is tasked with protecting federal agencies on the cyber level, and you heard the chairman talk about our cyber border. We are facing adversaries, nation states adversaries along cyber attacks from Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. And if we don't have the properly trained employees to protect our agencies, the .govs and other such things, we are weak. We cannot be weak here. cyber warfare is the new warfare. And that's why I think CISA already, by the way, does this. It trains employees from outside to get in more cyber focused, to be able to work in cyber positions. And the fact that we have 30,000, 35,000 unfilled federal workforce jobs right now, specifically focused in cyber, I think it is very important that we have an all-of-the-above approach to close that gap as soon as possible. We need to be protected, and we need to be protected soon. So I think this is a very good piece of legislation, along with other pieces of legislation that the chairman said we'll be working on. But this is something that we can get moving on rather quickly.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman, Mr. Magaziner, is recognized.
Yeah, and I also want to speak in support of this legislation. I think it is important, certainly, that we fill these cybersecurity jobs as quickly as possible. As you stated, cyberspace is a border in a very real sense for our country. And as we sit here today, there are foreign actors, whether they be from China, from Russia, or elsewhere, who are attacking U.S. businesses, attacking U.S. agencies, and we need to get these roles filled. And I would just point out that as a matter of good organizational management, in any organization, when you have job openings, one of the first things that you ought to do is offer people who already work elsewhere in your organization a chance to advance, a chance to get the skills, the credentials they need in order to build their careers. That's part of how you build morale. That's part of how you fill positions quickly, is you start by looking in your own agency. And that doesn't mean you don't post jobs externally at the same time. You can do both. But I think that this is a common sense piece of legislation. It's something that any good organization should do. And I would just note that all of us unanimously a few minutes ago voted for another good piece of legislation that asked CISA to perform a number of cybersecurity related duties when it comes to open source software. And so I think it would be hypocritical of us, on the one hand, to say we want CISA to do all these things, and then on the other hand, not advance legislation to help give them the staffing to actually fulfill that mission. So I'm in full support, and I thank you.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And in regards to just clarity, and maybe the author can speak to it, but on line 12, page 2 of the bill, where it talks about who are not currently in a cybersecurity position for work and matters related to cybersecurity at the department. And then you take line 12 and then you pair it with line 24, same page, providing on-the-job instruction under the supervision of experienced cybersecurity staff. Here's my question. If it's not someone currently working in any area of cybersecurity, yet you're offering on-the-job training, could there be a potential for the lack of efficiency in programming that the federal government's offering? If this training says, hey, while you're on the job, we're also going to train you for this, and it lessen their role, which could then compromise their current duties?
Well, good question.
Ranking member is recognized.
First of all, everyone that works in the CISA operation has to have a security clearance. For what we're talking about, all these jobs require that. Secondly, if they are not able to perform the duties, we contract out those services, which generally cost 2-3 times more. So what we're trying to do in the long run is bring these services in-house, saving us money. Right now, the vacancies are here, but the tasks still have to be performed, and they're being performed by private contractors, and that's, at this point, the most expensive way to go. And so that's what we're trying to do.
Would the gentleman yield for me too? So what we're talking, within this cybersecurity world, there are various levels of certifications, right? So let's say you're at level 2, and I'm making up a number scheme, but there's a level 3 and a level 4. What they already have, CISA already has an academy inside to train its own people. This gives them other authorizations to take a person who's, let's say, a level 2 to the next level and internally train them for capability to do cybersecurity stuff. I understand the gentlelady's concern about the disinformation stuff that we heard about last year, But this is about technical skills in cybersecurity. It's not really related to that proposed office that, and some of the stuff there. So that's why I'm fully supportive of the bill as it's written. And thank you for yielding, you reclaim. The gentleman yields. Anyone else? Mr. Jimenez is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And frankly, I'm not even sure why we need a bill like for this. This is just good management practices. To have people given the ability to move up in the organization and to hire from within or to train from within for higher positions is just good management practices. I'm actually surprised we actually need a bill to tell them to do this. So I have no issue with this. People inside the current employees can look forward and say, hey, there's a way to move up in this organization. It's a career path, and it just makes sense to me. So
Will the chairman, will the member yield?
Yeah, sure.
Gentleman yield. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Just to add on, this is, CISA currently does this within its agency. This would allow the department, this gives CISA the authority to develop this practice to maybe train someone from FEMA or another agency under the department in DHS.
Under DHS.
So someone from FEMA or another department under DHS or agency under DHS to come over and have this training. So CISA currently has the authority to do the training for its own staff. This would allow them to say if someone we need these cybersecurity jobs filled, this would allow someone from FEMA or somewhere else to move over if they want to learn the skills. This gives them the authority to develop the curriculum, which they already have the curriculum, they're doing it for its own members. It's just gives them the authority to do it for other employees of other agencies under the department.
Thank the gentleman for that clarification. And
I still have some
you
time?
reclaim?
Yes,
Yeah,
I do.
okay.
Okay. It's all under the same department, though, right? DHS?
Yes.
Correct.
So for me, it's like it's the secretary of DHS should have the ability to do this, throughout his or her department. And so this is just good management practices to allow people inside the entire department the ability to move inside that department to different areas for career advancement. So again, I know maybe the federal government works a little bit different than where I'm used to local government, but we're not constrained by a division within a department. And so I understand it's not bad. Look, that's what's required, it's required, but just good management practice to allow your employees within your department to have upward mobility in different areas.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Payne is recognized from New Jersey. Gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill? I think you've spoken. You'll need to get someone else to yield to you.
Sure.
Mr. Bishop is recognized.
To speak on the bill.
To speak on the bill.
And then yield to Ms. Green.
And yields to Ms. Green. Ms. Green, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. I truly believe in good management practices, so I completely agree with you, but unfortunately, CISA has proven they have a track record of spying on the American people, and good business practices do not reward that type of behavior. And this also happens in Homeland Security. Again, cybersecurity is such an important issue, not only within our government and our military, but also to private businesses who are often victims of attack, as well as individuals by cyber threats. And I'm opposed to this bill because of the language here. I think that we don't reward bad behavior, and that's a big problem that exists here in the federal government. I believe in cybersecurity. I want to vote for this bill, but the language here where we're creating a training program within CISA, who again has a proven record, it's a fact that they've spied on the American people, and so has Homeland. Homeland joined with big tech companies and censored many people, including myself, by the way. And I hope that never happens to any of you or anyone on this committee or any other American, but it has happened. And so I don't believe in creating a training program that undoubtedly has to cost money in order to give people raises or new jobs or new duties when they may have a track record of violating people's First Amendment rights. I yield.
I'll add a comment or two. And I do this advisedly because I've been a little bit of bull in the china shop on the other bill, out of certainly attempt to be constructive and thinking that I've sort of seen, as I say, things get to the floor, then you got other problems, and with that other one, I'm making excuses for myself. But I will say the lady's comments are well taken, and I think so are the chairman's. And this is the problem. Just to put a finer point on it, and I know this is something that's probably not shared in some ways by, well, at all by colleagues across the aisle, but there is this concern, and she says it correctly, that it was CISA that saw fit, I think unilaterally, to expand its mission to such things as cognitive infrastructure, and it has engaged, and part of what we've learned from, and we did a hearing in the subcommittee on oversight on this just recently, Mr. Ivey, right? And it's preliminary indications. I'd say we don't know the depth of this at this point. We're trying to find out, but there's this censorship laundering complex, or enterprise. There are outside groups who have helped CISA ultimately engage with social media companies to suppress entire narratives out in the public discourse in a way that I think is utterly inconsistent with the mission of the United States government as a whole under the First Amendment, and certainly is not within the purview of CISA. Is all that stuff that they've done, is their MDM team part of cybersecurity? I mean, that's their mission, is cybersecurity. So since they're doing this, it does beg the question whether they so regard it. Now, I think the chairman is also correct. That's not what cybersecurity is. The conundrum is that by virtue of the way they've carried out their mission, they've made it more difficult for this committee to know what to do when we're drafting law to do what we certainly you ought to be able to train from within people to do the technical aspects of cybersecurity. I don't want to train more censors, though, from within DHS and plant them in CISA so that it can overreach its mission. So I thank the gentlelady, and seeing if anybody wants the time. It's about a minute left.
Would you yield?
I would yield to Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, and I don't think anyone does. I would just like to point out that simply because a member says something is a fact does not mean it is a fact. We have other committees, Mr. Bishop, where we can debate this. But one of the essential functions of CISA is to protect our elections, and to protect our elections from cybersecurity infiltration and interference from foreign actors.
I'll reclaim the time, Mr. Goldman, because they only have that function by virtue of Jay Johnson saying that our elections are critical infrastructure, and the terminology of critical infrastructure having been committed to their responsibility. And I understand. Look, I didn't even anticipate it. I understand folks on the other side of the aisle don't see much in the entire issue, but I think it's there, and so that's just a difference of opinion. I'm out of time, sir.
May I be recognized?
Give me just a second. I do want to make this statement. This is a little bit outside, I think, the content of this bill, but I understand also that people here on the committee on both sides have strong feelings about this. So I'm going to be a little bit lenient on this and allow a little bit more talk, but I don't want to spend all day on this. Mr. Goldman, you are recognized, and the bill isn't about disinformation. The bill is about a training academy at CISA who's tasked with protecting the .gov cyber networks.
Right.
You're recognized.
And just to follow up very briefly, Mr. Bishop, I do agree that we are in a little bit of a different period over the last 6 or 7 years. I think it's well established that Russia used cybersecurity measures to interfere in the election of 2016. That is the uniform assessment of the intelligence community, of a bipartisan Senate report, of the Mueller report. We don't need to rehash that. I do agree with you, and I hope we can engage on a meaningful discussion about where the line is. At what point, where do we cross a line of simply protecting our elections and veer into what is protected speech? And so I hope you and I, in a more rational, bipartisan way, can have a conversation about this, that this is not the time for. And I yield to Mr.
The gentleman yield to me just briefly. Just to say thank you for that. And I do think that this should be a bipartisan enterprise because there are probably excesses in rhetoric and exaggerations on both sides of it. And I don't mean intentional exaggerations, but I do think there is a place for us to meet on this issue because it's an important one and we could get there. Thanks.
Gentleman reclaims and yields to Mr. Ivey.
Thank you. I agree with the chairman and Mr. Garbarino. I mean, and the ranking member as well. We're just behind as far as the number of trained cybersecurity officials that we have, and we need to catch up quickly. We need to, have started doing this yesterday. So I take Mr. Bishop's point. We sat in the same hearing. We came out in different places on it, but for the purposes of this, I think it's clear that this is something the United States needs to do for purposes of national security. Now I yield back.
Mr. Goldman reclaims.
I reclaim. Anyone else?
Would you yield?
Of course.
In the Army, we had your company commander, and you've got 3 platoons, and you've got one platoon leader who's using his machine guns very poorly. In fact, he's misusing his machine guns. You don't take his machine guns from him. You teach him how to use them. If you have a problem with what CISA is doing, you don't take tools away from them to do their job. You enforce standards on them. This particular issue is about equipping an agency who has the mission to defend the .gov domains against Russia and China. Their ability to train in-house across the DHS spectrum is a critical tool that is necessary. Now, we're not going to take their machine guns from them. What we're going to do is enforce standards on them to make sure they're not doing things that we agree have been done in the past incorrectly. But this is about making sure they have the tools to do the job and the mission that department has been given. And so I fully support this bill, despite the concerns that have been raised, concerns which I do see as valid. But the platoon leader who's misusing his machine guns, using them inappropriately, using them wrongly, doesn't get the machine guns taken away. They get trained, they get oversighted, and it gets enforced, or you fire the platoon leader and you bring in a new platoon leader. And I yield. You reclaim?
I reclaim briefly only to say I think that's a very good analogy, and I hope we use that analogy across the board with our federal agencies, and rather than try to defund federal agencies, that we try to enact better standards and accountability. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to be recognized to discuss on the bill? Mr. Pfluger, you're recognized.
Move to strike the last word.
So?
Will the gentleman yield?
I'll yield to Mr. Garbarino.
I just want to add, CISA, there are 16 critical infrastructure sectors. CISA is responsible as the sector risk management agency for 8 of them. Chemical, communications, commercial facilities, critical manufacturing, dams, IT, emergency services, nuclear reactor materials, and waste. These are 8 sectors that we want to make sure are protected as best as they can be and make sure they have the proper employees with the proper training. Our adversaries are attacking us millions of times a day through cyber intrusions. This is something that we need to make sure we are fully protected against. CISA, whatever questions there are about election and election integrity, that's not CISA's only role. Like I said, there are 8 critical infrastructure sectors of the 16 that CISA is the sector risk management agency for. We need to make sure that they have the employees. Yes, they should hire people from outside, and they are trying to do that. They are working on that. But there are 35,000 open jobs right now that are needed to be filled, and we need to make sure that they have every tool that they need. They need to fill those jobs and protect our critical infrastructure. I thank the gentleman. I yield back to Mr. Pfluger.
Gentleman reclaims?
Yield back.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill? Are there any amendments to the measure? Hearing none, the question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 3208 to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 3254. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 3254.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and it's considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Payne of New Jersey for the purpose of explaining his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased that we are here today during Police Week to consider my legislation aimed at helping our country's first responders get the tools they need to carry out their missions safely and effectively. A few years back, when I led the Emergency Management Subcommittee, I became aware of the need for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, to establish a uniform and predictable process for Homeland Security grantees to secure authorization to purchase innovative equipment that delivers on the goals of the programs by not be on the standing authorized equipment list. Often, such innovative equipment is so novel that there are no standing national voluntary consensus standards needed for the technology to be placed on FEMA's authorized list. However, that same self-contained breathing apparatus or technical rescue helmet may be in use within the Department of Defense or elsewhere in the federal government, or even meet an international consensus standard that is unfamiliar to FEMA. My legislation would provide a state, local, tribal, and territorial organization that identifies a promising technology to help address a capability gap with a standing process to get an answer from FEMA about whether they can use urban area security innovation or state Homeland Security grant program funding to secure the equipment. I thank Representative Strong for co-sponsoring the bill and the International Association of Fire Chiefs for endorsing the bill. The First Responders Access to Innovative Technologies Act passed the House in the 115th, 116th, and I hope we can come together to get it done this Congress. With that, I ask my colleagues for their support of my bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill? Mr. Strong from Alabama, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Payne, it's an honor to co-sponsor this with you. As a licensed emergency medical technician for 34 years, 39 years as a firefighter, and also at one point served as a 911 dispatcher, I know firsthand how important it is that first responders have the equipment and technology they need to save lives. As threats evolve, first responders require advanced equipment to protect their communities. Technological advances oftentimes outpace the creation of voluntary consensus standards for first responder equipment. However, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, more affectionately known as FEMA, requires equipment purchased using funds through the State Homeland Security Grant Program and the Urban Area Security Initiative to meet or exceed applicable voluntary consensus standards. This requirement can create a barrier for first responders from using grant funds to acquire innovative technologies to keep us with and prepared for emerging threats. While FEMA does allow grantees to request the use of funds for equipment that does not meet or exceed consensus standards, H.R. 3254, the Responders Access to Innovative Technologies Act, streamlines that process by requiring the FEMA administrator to implement a standard process for reviewing such applications. As we look to the future, we must ensure that our nation's first responders have the technology they need to tackle emerging threats in their respective communities. Mr. Payne, I appreciate the opportunity to partner with you in this effort, and I urge my colleagues to assist our states and local first responders by supporting this bill. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill? Are there any amendments to the measure? Hearing none, the question now occurs on reporting the bill, H.R. 3254, to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. So we're back to the original. We are going to now go back to where we started today's hearing. And we're on H.R. 1501.
Mr. Chairman, in recognition or in anticipation of
You're
an
recognized.
amendment by the sponsor, I will withdraw the amendment that was pending at our when we suspended on this bill.
Okay. So pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 1501. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 1501.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with and it is considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Guest is bringing an amendment. Committee will suspend.
Mr. Chairman, No, I'm gonna waive on that one.
They're printing the amendment right now. If the committee will suspend for just a second.
Yeah, I'm okay with the language.
Yeah, please, yeah, would you, yeah, please. But we got to get copies first to the clerk. We'll just spend for a second.
What's that?
Are there any amendments on the bill?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1501 offered by Mr. Guest. Strike corporation, each place it appears, and insert business entity. Page 6, beginning line 18, insert the following. Business entity. The term business entity has the meaning given such term in Section 334 of the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, 15 U.S. Code 6764.
Gentleman is recognized to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A few minutes.
Hold on just a second, Mr. Guest. I got a little premature there. The clerk will distribute the amendment. Gentleman is recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A few moments ago, we had a discussion as related to an amendment offered by Mr. Bishop to clarify business, to change are to clarify corporations or business entities that would be covered under this particular legislation. There was also discussion offered by Mr. Ivey in addition to that. And so we have worked with legislative staff, worked with Mr. Ivey, worked with Mr. Bishop to try to bring clarity to that. And the amendment would strike corporation anywhere it appears within the bill and would replace that with the term business entity. Business entity is defined in Section 334 of the Graham-Reach-Briley Act. And I have the definition there that is contained there in Section 334. It says the term business entity means a corporation, association, partnership, limited liability company, limited liability partnership, or other legal entity. And so it has that catch-all. So if we're talking about some sort of business that is domiciled in some other country that may have some name other than how we refer to that here domestically, that is also captured within the definition of business entity. And based upon the feedback I've received, I think that Mr. Bishop would support this. I believe Mr. Ivey will as well. And committee staff believes that this is a proper remedy to the issues that were raised previously. So with that, I would encourage everyone to please support the amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to discuss the amendment?
Mr. Chairman. Well, I may be the other side. I'm sorry.
Mr. Ivey, you're
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the effort by Mr. Guest, Mr. Bishop, and the staff to turn this around so quickly, and I certainly support the amendment.
I thank both of you for working together on it. Does the gentleman yield, or is he reclaim?
I didn't, did I yield to Mr. Maybe that's why, I thought you were going to recognize someone on the other side.
Oh, okay.
But I'll take the rest of my
apologies.
time. That's perfect.
I'll yield back.
You yield back to him, okay.
All right, just fine. No, I think this is a substantial fix. I'm not sure it gets everything that needs to be fixed in that terminology, but it's a lot better, so I'm supportive of it. I also, just for the sake of completeness, I begged the question earlier with had another amendment indicated about the word domiciled. Still think that's conceivably a problem because it introduces uncertainty into the law, but especially the way this has changed, I actually think that word works okay. I'm going to leave it alone and not offer to change it more. Bottom line, I'll support this amendment, and with the amendment, I'd support the bill.
Gentleman yields. Does the gentleman reclaim or yield?
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to make comments on the amendment? Hearing none. There being no further discussion, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Guest. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Hearing none. Hearing none. The question now occurs on reporting the bill, H.R. 1501, to the House with favorable recommendation, as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. We are fortunate to have Ms. Jackson Lee from Texas, who couldn't be here earlier, and she would like to say a few comments about her bill that we've passed. And so the chair recognizes her for 5 minutes to discuss her bill.
I strike the last word, Mr. Chairman. It'll be a simple thank you for passing H.R. 3208, the DHS Cybersecurity on the Job Training Program Act. And as we are members of the Homeland Security Committee, I hope, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, you would know that my absence was unavoidable. I was at the White House with a constituent who was receiving the Medal of Valor, and from the Houston Police Department, which is the first Medal of Valor that the Houston Police Department has received in its history. And President Biden and General Garland were there with his family. And so we are Homeland Security. We know the importance of first responders, and they were honoring firefighters and They were honoring police and some posthumously, and I'm honored to have been there, and I'm very grateful to my colleagues for supporting the concept of this legislation to also further Homeland Security. With that, Mr. Chairman, I do want to put, the gentleman's name was Sergeant Simcoe. I'm going to put him on the record with all of his family. Congratulations, Sergeant Simcoe, and all the Medal of Valor winners today. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Without objection, on the previous, thank you, gentlelady. On the previous amendment, it'll be recognized as an ANS without objection. So, without objection, staff is authorized to make any required technical or conforming changes to reflect the actions of the committee today. This concludes consideration of the bills noticed by the committee today. So,
Mr. Chairman.
The ranking member is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to Clause 2L of Rule 11, I request that members have 2 calendar days to file with the clerk of the committee supplemental, additional, or minority views on the measures ordered reported by the committee today.
So ordered. There being no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.